Alpine Liquid Fertilizers is your full season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. Visit alpinepfl.com for more. Thanks to our show sponsors, the Soil School, Beef Market Update, and FMC Preschool. FMC Preschool is a product-agnostic program designed to equip growers and agriculture professionals with the latest tools and insights for effective weed management. From herbicide science to resistance trends, we're here to help you grow smarter. Learn more at fmcpreschool.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. I see that Ray is on already. Lilith is here as well. Greetings to all for joining us here on this very chilly episode of the Agronomists. I hope you're keeping warm wherever you may be. As always, for checking out the program, you can collect those CEU credits. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. Let us know you watched the program. Collect those CEU credits. We'll get those submitted for you. And while you're there, make sure you sign up for the email, the Agronomist email. It reminds you of what shows are coming up, when we're going live, so you don't miss it. And of course, if you've ever got any questions about those CEU credits, you can zip us an email there as well. All right, tonight's topic, it's a big one. It's one we get a lot of questions about. And I was right on time, and Wheat Pete's not here. I was going to rub it in his face. But anyway, all right, let's talk about phosphorus. So joining me for this conversation tonight, I've got Joanne Thiessen Martens with the University of Manitoba and Colin Elgie with OMAFA. And that is how I say it, Colin. Perfect. Perfect. Why not? Peter, I was on time. Not almost on time. Okay. Joanne, I'll start with you. First time on the show, so welcome here. What do you do at the University of Manitoba?
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Lyndsey. I'm happy to be here. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba, the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences. And I focus on soil fertility and chemistry. So I'm doing some research on those kinds of topics and focused mostly on phosphorus, but I dabble in the other nutrients too, and teaching right from the diploma level up to the graduate student level.
I was one of those diplomas, so they're obviously the favorite. Anyway, I'm just saying.
Obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe they should go to class. Okay, just putting that out there. All right. And Colin, what's keeping you busy with the Ontario Ministry of Agribusiness, Farming, and what is it now?
You're pretty close. Agriculture, food, and agribusiness. So we're dead into conference season now. We wrapped up SWAC earlier this month, I should say. We wrapped up Midwest Ag Conference in Waterloo last week. Tomorrow we've got the Eastern Ontario Crop Conference. So the Ontario Ag Conferences, they're everywhere. We're learning lots. We're sharing all kinds of amazing knowledge. So it's full in the swing of the knowledge type learning events. So
the knowledge sharing season, as you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, hearing good things. It is always, I do love this time of year. You get to sit in on some really interesting conversations. Fantastic. Hallway talk. Good questions that come out of that, always really important. Peter wants to know where your tie is. Peter, this is a tie-free zone. Yeah, there you go. Fix the button. Yeah.
Just imagine the tie, Peter.
Imagine the tie. There's a clip on one just off screen. Okay. All right. So we are going to talk about phosphorus. A few different angles to phosphorus, of course. There's the importance of it that we typically will touch on. There is the long-term, short-term, medium-term sort of this is a different nutrient than when we talk about nitrogen, but of course really important. And like nitrogen, there is that very important environmental component that we'll touch on tonight as well. So one of the key pieces of tonight's conversation is about that availability piece. So for those listening, for those watching, if you've got those questions, this is one of those parts of the planning process that can sometimes get a little stressful when we're trying to think about how much we apply versus how much is actually available, and is it available when the plant needs it? Always really good question. So, Joanne, I'll start with you because I think that's probably a good place to start. Is on sort of the fundamental understanding of phosphorus availability in the soil, because this one is a little bit different than some of our other nutrients, in that it does tend to get tied up. So walk us through, how do we need to think about phosphorus availability in the soil context?
Yeah, we can think about phosphorus as being present in the soil in sort of three main pools, I guess. What's actually available to plants right at this very moment. So it's in the soil solution. And then we have what we call labile phosphorus, which is the phosphorus that's not actually dissolved in the soil water right at this moment, but could very easily become dissolved and then used by plants. And then we have this really large pool, actually, of what we call non-labile or unavailable phosphorus. And that's the kind of stuff that gets released on very, very long timescales. We're talking sort of geological timescales because it's just part of the parent material. It takes a really long time to release. So we've got, we think we can call them pools like that, but really they're more like, a continuum, a gradient, because all of those have slightly different levels of solubility. And there's always a little bit of flux going back and forth between all those different forms of phosphorus in the soil. So it's pretty complex when you start thinking about, what your soil test actually means and how much is there and, for your crop to actually use.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think actually, Producer Jay, let's go to slide 1, because I think that sort of we've got a visual sort of to start thinking about this, and I think this would be really helpful in thinking about, and I'm glad you mentioned soil tests, and Colin, maybe I'll go to you on this. When we sit down, and I want to come back to this slide in just a minute, but we'll leave it up for a moment. When we sit down as growers or as agronomists to try and decide on how much phosphorus we're applying, and we're starting with a soil test, let's say we are. How important is that soil test, but also how limited is that soil test?
Yeah, so it's absolutely critical if you're looking to apply phosphorus in any form for any crop that you've got a soil test to base it off of. So that soil test, it's got limitations. It's a snapshot in time. And one of the real big limitations is it's grabbing such a small portion of that phosphorus that's in the soil. Like Joanne mentioned, there's a very small amount that's solution P. And when we talk about, phosphorus being in 10 parts per million or 20 part per million, we tend to think of that in terms of pounds per acre. But it's really just a more of an index than an actual measurement of what's actually in that soil. And yeah, when we look at the total phosphorus pool, it can be in terms of thousands of pounds per acre, but the amount that the plants can actually get at is so incredibly tiny. So the soil test kind of gives us that index to base our recommendations off of, and really we're looking for the crop response to that index is really how we make that plan.
Right. And Joanne, when I think about also, there's the possibility of a whole bunch of phosphorus in that soil, but we can't necessarily bank on its release, at a certain time. And so when I look at this, when we think about what potentially sort of holds on to phosphorus, what do we need to understand about our soil, our soil composition, on whether or not there's perhaps more or less available or going to be available phosphorus?
Mm-hmm. It really comes down to your soil pH. That's the biggest factor that influences how much phosphorus is available. So Phosphorus is most available kind of at right around neutral pH or slightly acidic, so between pH 6 to 7. And when you get more acidic than that, so down below 6, then that phosphorus, whether it's the phosphorus that was naturally occurring in the soil or phosphorus that you add through fertilizers, is always going to be reacting with aluminum and iron and forming these really stable compounds that don't dissolve again very easily. And if you've got more alkaline pH, so a pH above 7, then that phosphorus is going to be reacting with calcium and magnesium, like it mentions on this slide here. Most of our soils in the prairies are neutral to alkaline, so that's typically the process we are thinking about here. And again, those are not necessarily very soluble. I think the alkaline soils tend to be a little more giving back with their phosphorus than the really acidic soils are. But either way, if you're outside that pH 6 to 7, there's going to be some challenges with whatever phosphorus you add to the soil getting tied up in these kind of non-labile forms that are difficult for plants to access, at least in the short term.
So, and that then, Colin, is sort of the difference for Ontario soils. This is where, who is it who says we spend our first dime on lime, because we tend to deal with perhaps soils in the high 5s, low 6s, that we need to improve that pH before we even think about what we add on. So when we talk about liming to get that pH where we want it, is phosphorus one of the nutrients we're really aiming at making available here?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a scale on when we're looking at all of our macronutrients, all of our micronutrients. We've got certain areas in that pH scale that we can really increase the amount of manganese we've got when we go really acidic, but we decrease the amount of phosphorus that's available, the amount of potassium that's available. So it's all about finding that sweet spot. And that's where sometimes we can, I don't want to say over lime because it's hard to really get too high with that pH, but in areas where we don't need lime, we can often use something like variable rate application or better soil sampling to identify those areas that are very low pH are the ones we're trying to bring up to something, say 6 or 6.5. And the spots that are already there, they don't really need lime. We're not doing any benefit there. So yeah, lime pH, that's absolutely critical for phosphorus.
So Mark asks, and this is excellent question, Mark, can a person test for the different pools of phosphorus? So this makes me want to back up just a step, because we have different tests, right? Depending on where we are as to whether we use Olsen P or whether, so we do have differences in our phosphorus tests, but is it helpful to know, or what do our soil tests actually tell us when we're testing for phosphorus? Joanne, I'll start with you and then I'll go to you, Colin.
Sure. It is theoretically kind of sort of possible to test for the other pools. And there's tests that researchers use to try to identify sort of different levels of solubility, from very soluble to less soluble, and maybe even attach the name of a chemical compound, like octacalcium phosphate or something like that, to a certain pool.
Right.
But really, agronomically, they're not that useful. So as a farmer, it's just doing your standard agronomic soil test is the way to go, making sure that you're getting the right test for your type of soil, and your local lab will know what that is. And then, the rest of that phosphorus is maybe going to become available, and maybe not, but the amount that's actually there in those unavailable forms isn't really that important. It's many times more than what shows up in the soil test. So, does it matter if it's 50 times more or 100 times more? Not really.
Right.
Yeah, and that's really the reason why we continue to soil test, is over time some of that phosphorus becomes available, and that's why we test 3 years down the road, 6 years down the road, 10 years down the road, is to identify some of that phosphorus that's become available. But yeah, I agree, Joanne, that The other pools, they absolutely don't matter when it comes to making a recommendation.
Right, on the agronomic side. So, Mark, if you really would like to become a soil scientist, have at her. Fill your boots, and you can name all those parts of soil, phosphorus. But right, for when we're trying to make those agronomic decisions, it's not necessarily. Yes, not necessarily. And Ray says, I love the theoretically possible, kind of. It's a new take on it depends. Because, Joanne, we get a lot of it depends on this show. Yes, because, well,
should have a button for that. Just it depends.
It depends. It depends. I actually think Jay might have one, and we just need it. I need it on like my desk where I can just hit it and away you go. Okay, so we need a soil test for sure. We need to understand that there will be more phosphorus in the soil. Colin, I want to just touch on this for a moment because I think sometimes, or often, we sort of compare and contrast nitrogen and phosphorus for good reason, right? I mean, we can lose them both in different ways. They can be tied up or in different ways, but these are things that we think about. And so that test for phosphorus as well, we think about this as well in that release. And so does this help to explain, though, why for something like the nitrate test, we're mineralizing N in season and it's available in season, but phosphorus is less so. That sort of like warm, wet weather gives us more phosphorus. That's not necessarily the apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, and it's more really about the plant availability of that phosphorus. So how quickly can that phosphorus get into the plant? And that's kind of where it differs quite to the opposite of nitrogen. So nitrogen, once it's on the field in the soil, it's able to move around with the water. You can apply it, a foot and a half away, and it's still going to make it to the plant. Phosphorus, though, it moves incredibly slowly, something like a millimeter per year type range. So if you don't have a plant root that's in that vicinity, or something like mycorrhizal fungi that's able to actually access that phosphorus, pick it up within a very close distance, then yeah, it's essentially unavailable to that plant.
Okay. So it does move, but not really. Right. Teeny bit. Joanne, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, only to emphasize that Colin is exactly right. And so there's all kinds of implications for the management of phosphorus versus nitrogen in terms of how you apply it, where you apply it, when you apply it, those kinds of things that you need to be thinking about just because of that fact that it doesn't really move very much. But then the good side, on the other side, is it's way less prone to leaching away like nitrogen will from the soil. So the size of the losses to the environment are typically a lot smaller for phosphorus than they are for nitrogen.
Right. We do, and we have some slides. We're going to touch on this later on the ways that we can lose phosphorus or do need to worry about where phosphorus goes. But for the most part, it is not nearly as prone to loss. Doesn't mean we can't lose it. And we do need to manage for that, but we'll tackle that in a bit. I did want to, so one of the things, and Colin, I think you mentioned it earlier on, and it's the thing I want to touch on now, and Producer Jay, I'm going to, in a moment, we'll go to the clip with Jeremy Boychin out of the Wheat School in predicting a response. So this is one of the key questions I think that often comes up is, all right, I need to add phosphorus, let's say near the seed, we need it early, but potentially, depending on what your soil test is, can you count on a response? So it's always that question. So we're going to watch this clip, and then that is the question we're going to come back to, is applying and counting on that response to phosphorus applications.
Now we know that phosphorus and potassium won't be changing as much as we're dealing with nitrogen, but it's still an important factor and something for us to consider when we're looking to maximize our yield potential, because we know that depending on the amount of phosphorus and potassium in the soil, our yield response of that wheat crop is going to change. And also, it's going to play a role in how we are managing our long-term phosphorus and potassium plan. Because phosphorus and potassium they take a little bit more time to manage, and typically we want to look at a longer time scale, more specifically at phosphorus. So when we think about phosphorus and we're putting down phosphorus with our wheat seed, and we get that soil test back and it tells us, okay, Mr. Farmer, we have 20 pounds of phosphorus in the soil. What does that mean for my application? What does that mean in terms of yield response? And we know, based on research done by Ross McKenzie and Alberta Ag historically, that there are yield responses that we can expect from phosphorus application based on our soil test phosphorus. Now remember, Kelowna is the soil test method we want for phosphorus in Alberta. That's what all of our recommendations are on. So if you're getting soil tests done, looking at phosphorus, make sure you're looking at the Kelowna soil test for phosphorus. So when we get those numbers back, based on what we can get an idea of, if I put phosphorus down, am I or am I not likely to see a yield response? So with the medium to low range of phosphorus, which is 50 pounds of phosphorus in the soil, so 25 ppm or less, we have a 60 to 100% chance of seeing a yield response. So this is going to cover a lot of the soils in Alberta, Western Canada. A lot of them are in that medium to low range. But if you're in the soil test range of 50 pounds or greater, or 25 ppm or greater, the likelihood of seeing a response is in that 30 to 50% range. So less likely to see a response. You say, Jeremy, does that mean I shouldn't be applying phosphorus if my soil test phosphorus is high? And my response is going to be, you should still be applying phosphorus because that crop is removing phosphorus from the soil.
Our sponsors tonight are FMC Preschool, the Soil School, and Beef Market Update. Launched in 2009, Beef Market Update is one of Real Agriculture's longest-running features. Hear Ann Wasco every second Friday to talk about the beef markets in Canada and the U.S. Featuring cattle on feed reports, export data, calf run volumes, slaughter numbers, and more, tune into Real Ag Radio or on demand at realagriculture.com and whenever you get your podcasts.
All right. We have some great questions. I don't know who this Sean guy is, but I feel like he's a plant. Meaning he was planted in the audience, not a, actual plant. Okay. So this question of, a few things there. This question of a response, or if I have sufficient P on a soil test, do I still need to add? Those are both, I think, really important questions. So, and Peter, yes, I will get to your question, and Sean will address yours as well. But Joanne, I want to go to you first. That question of, why do we still apply phosphorus if our soil test says we probably have sufficient phosphorus? Jeremy sort of touches on removal, but why is it so key?
Yeah, it really comes down to whether the plant can get at that phosphorus when it really needs it early in the season. So lots of work done here on the prairies has shown that, when soil's cold and those little plants are just starting to grow and their roots aren't very big yet, they really benefit from having at least a little bit of phosphorus close to the seed. So we call that starter phosphorus here, starter P. And even when soil test P is adequate to high, we still tend to see at least a bit of a response, again, in those conditions when the soil is cold. And that's just because the phosphorus is moving even less than it was before. It's being released from the soil even more slowly than normal when the soil is cold. So I would differ a little bit with the clip and saying, you don't necessarily need to match removal if your soil test phosphorus is already high. You can probably dial it back some, but lots of crops will benefit from that little bit of starter P.
Right. And we certainly have seen instances where you do want to draw it down. Right, if you've got a history of, let's say, swine manure, that sort of stuff, and you are trying to pull it down, but those little seedlings, whatever they may be, often need it. So, Colin, there's a guy named Peter in the chat who will tell you that wheat especially must always have phosphorus in the fall. So similar, I mean, different geographies, but similar story. Even into warm soil, potentially in the fall for wheat, we still put down phosphorus because of that availability question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just having that starter right there that helps out so much with a wheat crop and a corn crop. We don't see it, like Peter mentioned. We don't see it with soybeans quite as much. But really, the difference I think between why broadcast works in soybeans and wheat versus corn is that corn's a baby. If it doesn't have that phosphorus readily available, and a nice band to it, it doesn't respond as well. I think a big part of that is where some of those roots are. Corn, we've got a lot of roots that are getting down in the soil relatively quick. They like having that band of phosphorus there that's high concentration, that's available. Whereas wheat and beans, I think they tend to have more roots closer to the surface, where maybe some of that phosphorus is already lying in the soil. But yeah, I think it boils down to corn being a bit of a princess when it comes to that.
Okay. I like the baby, because we say corn is king, but maybe corn is not so king. Maybe corn needs a bit of a soother sometimes. Okay. Now, but later when it gets going, corn is very impressive when it hits its rapid growth phase. It is quite amazing to hear it snapping and rustling, and away it goes. But early on, you're right. It can be. So, okay, but Colin, you touched on something, and Joanne, feel free to hop in here. The rooting structure, and this sort of dovetails into eventually Sean's point. Does our rooting type play a role here then on how much a crop can access soil phosphorus? So, because our rooting structure is very different. Joanne, go ahead.
Yeah, it really does, and not just the rooting structure, but also different mechanisms that plants use to get at that soil phosphorus. And there's some neat research done back in, I think, the 60s, back here at U of M, showing how different types of plants will or will not actually grow extra roots in a zone that has, like a fertilizer band. And, a crop like canola, which at the time they called rapeseed, and buckwheat, they will grow a bunch of extra roots if they find a phosphorus-rich zone. Flax, clueless. It had to be guided to, they had used these funnel things to kind of guide the roots. It couldn't find that phosphorus on its own because it didn't really need to. That's the thing. It's flax is so dependent and has such a strong relationship with mycorrhizal fungi that it sort of couldn't really care less about the fertilizer that you've applied. I shouldn't say couldn't care less, because it does respond in some cases, but typically it is not as responsive to fertilizers because it has that very strong relationship with mycorrhizal fungi, who are out scavenging phosphorus from everywhere. And we know plants like canola, a lot of the legumes will actually produce these compounds from their roots that modify the soil right around the roots. We call that the rhizosphere. They'll acidify it, which in an alkaline soil, that makes the phosphorus more available. They exude these other compounds that basically help release soil phosphorus and make it available for plants. So those things, along with the rooting structure, like exactly where those roots are growing, if it's more of a taproot versus a spreading fibrous root, really influence the appropriate placement and rate and the timing and all those kinds of things, all those phosphorus management questions.
Mm-hmm. Roots are quite fascinating. Frankly, just what happens below ground is very fascinating. Okay, Producer Jay, let's bring up, I think Colin slide 1, because we're gonna touch back on this corn question a little bit. That is some sad looking corn, Colin. So what happened here?
Yeah, so when we talk about phosphorus availability and the rooting structure, that's where this picture to me kind of plays right into that. So it is absolutely sad looking barf type corn, and we can see the purpling there, which we tend to think phosphorus deficiency means purple corn. Most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time that purpling is just a different symptom of stress that isn't necessarily phosphorus deficiency. but in this case it was. And so when we look at the picture in the back there, we can see that there's all kinds of clumps in that soil. It was obviously worked wet. In this case, the field was worked about a week ahead of when it should have been and planted about a week and a half of when it should have been. And it showed right through the season. So in this case, it's related to how those roots grow, and they're slotted into wet soil that's smeared sidewalls. Those roots can't get access to any of the fertilizer that might be in that soil already. And in this case, being a lower testing phosphorus field to begin with, combined with nowhere for those roots to get out and get it, it just made for a kind of a cool picture. But yeah.
Yeah. I was going to point out that based on those clumps, it might not have been worked at the right time, but I didn't know if it was your field, so I didn't want to say anything. But I'm glad that you did, Colin. That's great. I don't need to judge anybody's tillage.
Of course.
Actually, that's not true. I judge it all the time. Okay. All right. So Mark's got some good questions that I want to build off of, but we'll hit on Sean's before he texts me and tells me I better ask his question. So, okay. So, but this does come down to the question of additions, availability, and what actually, how much we actually add, how much is actually available. So we certainly know that there are products out there that claim to have higher availability, so you can potentially apply less. Colin, how do you broach that subject as far as pounds added, pounds available, and making that call on products?
So to me, there's kind of two different things at play here. First is that response, and we kind of talked about it earlier. It depends where your soil test level is. If you're in a very low testing soil, maybe you're going to see that bit of difference between the products, depending on solubility and that kind of thing. But I really think that if you're in an extremely low situation, you may not be able to see as exactly what their claims are saying. Once you get on the higher end, yeah, absolutely. You can cut down to, in this case, instead of 60 pounds of MAP, cut down to 30 pounds of MAP. You might get the same response as you would at this other product at 20 to 30 pounds. So I think there's a little bit of marketing that's going on there. The other side of things is that removal of P is removal of P. So if you're looking to build levels or maintain soil test levels, it doesn't matter if you're using a product that is more efficient and does give you a better response. If you're looking to keep those levels where they're at, you've got to replace pound for pound.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so Joanne, you've got, I think it's your slide 3. This actually works really well into this conversation because it's a great point, Colin, of like, what are you trying to achieve and what are you starting with? Right, are sort of the two parameters. I think that sometimes we see products like this, or perhaps on rented land. Let's say you're not trying to build. Let's say you don't know if you'll have this land next year, and you're just putting what your crop's going to take off and away you go. But it does bring the question of what are you trying to do year over year. So, Joanne, if you will, walk us through this idea of building, maintaining versus drawing down.
Sure, it really comes down to not just thinking about, am I going to get a response this year, but really the long-term view on phosphorus, which is important to think, especially if you're invested long-term in a particular parcel of land. So with this diagram, I'll just point out, so on the bottom, we've got those soil test phosphorus levels, just like very low, medium, all the way up to really high. And then going up the side on the y-axis, we've got the phosphorus application rate relative to the crop phosphorus removal. So what that means there is the number 1 means that you are adding the same amount as your crop removes. It may not be exactly the same in every year. Of course, we can't totally predict what a crop is going to remove. If we could predict yields with that accuracy, we would be very different, in a very different place than we are right now. And right. But anyway, but just what do you expect it'll remove? Kind of averaged over, say, a whole rotation or a longer term view. So starting actually in the middle of the graph, in that maintenance range, this is where you want to kind of be long term, where you are adding back in, pound for pound, like Colin said, whatever your crops are removing. And you can figure out what your crop removal is. There's book values out there. In the prairies here, we have this prairie nutrient removal calculator. There's a new app for nutrient budgeting in organic farming systems. And so you can figure that out. Now, let's say you are in the situation where you acquired a piece of land that hasn't had a good history of phosphorus application, and so you are testing really low. Then maybe you do want to add more phosphorus than your crop is going to remove for a few years. So that's the left-hand side of the graph there. They suggest going up to double what your crop will actually remove from the soil. Now, the key there is to keep on soil testing every few years to see where you're at so that you can adjust back, over into that middle zone if you need to. Then on the right-hand side of the graph, we've got this, what we call the drawdown range. And that is where, like you mentioned, a situation where maybe there's been, say, a lot of manure applied for whatever reason, and your soil is testing really high. Chances are you're not going to get a bigger crop response to a high rate of P than you are to a low rate of P. As long as your crop gets that starter P, it's going to be okay. So that means you can actually reduce your rate down to, let's say, about half of what your crop removal is, and then start pulling that soil test phosphorus down a little bit over the years. It can take a long time. Sometimes you can not apply any P, grow, a decent crop. If let's say you're starting at a good high level, you grow a crop, you soil test again the following year, and it's exactly the same. It's like, where did it come from? Well, it just came from those. Yeah, it's magic. It came from those long-term non-labile pools and just sort of replenished what is picked up by the soil test. So to actually see a change in your soil test P can take a few years.
So, and Colin, I'll maybe put Mark's question to you on this one. And so that, I think, because Joanne, I think that does tie into, especially if you use manure on a regular basis. So Mark has said, he doesn't necessarily see a phosphorus response or I think he says an economic response to adding phosphorus with starter P, but it's possible because of a background of manure, so a history of manure. And so his question for that then is there a cover crop species that will free up the tied up phosphorus to make it more available to future crops? And if there is one, we could probably be very wealthy. So Colin, is there one that will suddenly make it available?
So I'll give you a bit of an anecdotal answer to that with very little, I'd say, real data applied to it. So on our farm here, we grow processing peas, and then we follow that with a crop of buckwheat, which we take to harvest. And then following that, we plant winter wheat. And so normally, depending on the year, we might be getting to that buckwheat late into harvest, and the wheat gets in later. What we see very often is that crop absolutely thrives after that buckwheat has been in the field, planted and harvested. That wheat crop thrives. So there's a well documented research that shows that buckwheat can pull phosphorus from the soil, increase the availability from it, and pass that along to the following crop. I guess I don't know which other crops, cover crops, might follow that same pattern. But buckwheat, for us anyways, we've seen a pretty good response to it with that phosphorus.
Mm-hmm. Now, but that is buckwheat you would have taken to seed, like it grew and completed its life cycle. Because I know buckwheat does sometimes get used, but it gets worked down or it gets sprayed out, or and I know potato growers use it for like as a cover crop as well. So we've got aspects that use it, but not everybody lets it go to seed. So I do wonder if that works in there too. And then there's also, I was going to say, Joanne,
so that
the
is something.
rhizosphere question. Yeah,
It does. Yeah, I've done a little bit of research on buckwheat. I've also read some of the other research that's been done, and especially looking at its ability to mobilize phosphorus from soils that are testing really low in phosphorus. And the research that I've seen will sometimes observe an effect, but not generally big enough to be agronomically important. And so there's sort of a mismatch from what the researchers seem to see and this very well-established reputation that buckwheat has as this phosphorus mobilizer. And in a little bit of research that I did myself, I was on a very low phosphorus soil. It was about 3 parts per million Olsen P. Really low. We were having trouble growing any kind of crops there, which is, of course, wonderful for doing phosphorus research on.
Right.
And so I was looking at exactly this question, can this buckwheat, and I also looked at peas and I looked at faba beans, can they mobilize some phosphorus and essentially feed it to the next crop from different types of fertilizers? So I was looking at monoammonium phosphate and also a struvite fertilizer, crystal green. Anyway, but the thing was that in that soil, our buckwheat in the control treatment that was unfertilized grew to be about 8 to 10 inches tall. And meanwhile, in the fertilized treatment, it was, 4 feet tall, right?
Right.
3.5 to 4 feet tall. So you have to wonder, well, and then we saw there was no benefit to the following crop from any of them really, but especially that really small one, like how could it possibly mobilize phosphorus if it's not really growing itself? Yep. So I think it can have a role in sort of when you're just kind of low in phosphorus, but when you get to those really low P conditions, then even it doesn't thrive enough to make a difference. And I've been looking at what is it about buckwheat that does it. I've looked at like what are the compounds around the roots. It's a bit mysterious. It's not showing up the usual suspects of like citric acid around the roots and things like that. So it's an area of ongoing research in my lab right now.
So if corn is a bit of a baby, buckwheat is the international man of mystery. And we just don't know enough about buckwheat. But I will say there are also comments of you have to be careful what you wish for, because not all cover crops are ones you want to plant because you may have them forever after you plant them. So they may stick around as a weed from then on. So there is that question too. Because Mark said, is that buckwheat or buckwheat? So there you go. Okay. So fascinating though. And on this though, so Colin, you said it was processing peas, then buckwheat, then went to winter wheat, and it did well. Is there the possibility that the pea holdover could also benefit the wheat that went in? Because wheat does like pea stubble too, right? So I don't know. I wonder what's happening there.
Yeah, and we're dealing with we've got pretty moderate phosphorus soils to begin with, so we're not dealing from a low testing soil. So it could be that's the difference. It could be the rotation. It's just kind of, like I said, very little actual real data. It's just kind of anecdotally we've seen that buckwheat compared to a wheat crop without buckwheat, it seems to do a bit better. But I think the cover cropping in general, in my mind, having that phosphorus cycling through that plant. So, most cover crops anyways, I would say would help with that phosphorus availability, just keeping that phosphorus cycling through. But I'm definitely intrigued about the buckwheat, and I'd love to see your research, Joanne, because it's something that's pretty small crop around here, and kind of it's really interesting anyways.
Mm-hmm. It does show up in some interesting spots. So I like that there's a mystery around it, because that means there's more to come. Everybody stay tuned. We're going to find out. Yes, exactly. Okay. We don't have a lot of time left, and I do want to talk a bit about, of course, movement and the environmental aspect. And of course, Peter's got a great question that comes in from Perry, asking about low and medium and high levels. Do we need to adjust those based on yield potential? But let's go to a clip from a few years ago with Mary McRae about managing tiles. So talking about, of course, when phosphorus does move how it moves and how we have to manage that. So Producer Jay, if you would.
Miriam, you talked about tiles, and they come out under a lot of scrutiny, and I'm just wondering, what can we do to manage our tiles better? What do we need to understand as farmers?
Well, I think the first place to begin is to realize that we have to manage things in the surface and in the subsurface, and we don't want to do something that is maybe going to control things at the surface but be at the expense of losses in the subsurface in tile drainage. So I think it's important to remember that we need tiles because we need to be able to get on fields and drain fields in order to get a yield, but we know that there can be environmental consequences. And so I guess the first thing is there are certain conditions under which tiles have larger consequences. And so those conditions can sometimes relate to soil texture. So where you live, are you in the heavy clays or are you in the loamy soils, which seem to be able to buffer the phosphorus out a little bit more. Another feature that can really increase phosphorus loss in tile drains, is connectivity between phosphorus-rich surface soils and the tile drains through what we call preferential flow or macropores. So that can be wormholes, cracks, root channels, you name it. So if we don't, so there are certain conditions, like if you have really stratified high phosphorus soils at the surface, those are conditions where if you have a lot of connection between the surface and your tiles, that can rapidly enter tiles. So what we want to do is really disconnect that source from that pathway. And so some ways to do that would be simply to have lower soil P or manage the supply in your soil. So you can do that either by reducing your soil phosphorus or by applying it in the subsurface, like by banding. These are all sorts of things that we can do to reduce some of that, either reduce that stratification or just sort of disconnect that supply from those preferential flow paths into tile drains.
Our sponsors tonight are the Beef Market Update, FMC Preschool, and the Soil School. Soil health directly impacts crop health, which directly impacts your bottom line. Real Agriculture's Soil School provides an opportunity for farmers to learn how to improve soil through discussions on the use of cover crops, strip till and no-till, compost, manure, and more. The Soil School is made possible by support from the Mosaic Company. Visit realagriculture.com/soil-school for more.
Okay, so some big questions here on a few things on how we lose phosphorus, so how we have to manage that, and we did have just a couple weeks ago we had Dr. David Lobb on to talk about tillage erosion, and we did touch on wind and water erosion, so that's a key part here, is on how it moves. So, and then Peter, we will get to your question, but Producer Jay, let's go to Joanne's slide 4, I think it is, and then we'll go after that to Colin's slide 3 to sort of cover this. So the ways in which we lose phosphorus. So Joanne, if you can walk us through why are things like runoff or water or wind erosion, why do we lose phosphorus that way?
So first, I want to point out one thing about phosphorus losses, because earlier we said we don't lose much. So first of all, why are we even talking about this? And the issue is that it only takes a teeny tiny amount that actually gets into an aquatic ecosystem like a lake or a pond or whatever to cause a big problem. So that's kind of the situation that we're thinking about here. So the way that Don Flayton actually taught me to think about water quality protection in terms of phosphorus is in this sort of three-pronged model where you have to have all three of these things to actually create a problem. You have to have a phosphorus source, so someplace it's coming from or it can actually escape from. You have to have a way that it can move, a pathway or a transport. And then you have to have a sensitive receptor, like some kind of water body generally that will be impacted by that phosphorus to actually have a problem. And we, here in the prairies, it's really difficult to control our transport processes because we lose most of our phosphorus actually in snowmelt in the spring. And so we think about managing those by reducing the amount of phosphorus that's available to be lost in the first place, sources.
Right.
So we focus on nutrient management practices primarily to help mitigate or avoid our phosphorus pollution problems. In many other places of the world, though, you can focus on those transport pathways, actually, like so soil and water management practices, where you're actually keeping that soil on the field. You are preventing the water from running off into that sensitive water body as a way to sort of minimize the impact of phosphorus loss on the environment.
So I feel like we have a recurring theme in agriculture. We have the disease triangle. Now we have the phosphorus trouble triangle. We've got so many triangles. I'm gonna make a shirt. Anyway, okay. So, but it's a key point. I like how we line this out, that it's only a problem if those three exist, right? So if it's moving and if there's a water source, we need to worry about that. If it's moving, but it's, staying on perhaps other ground or whatever, we are less concerned. But it still could be financially an issue if we're moving our best topsoil somewhere else, but less so. And I think, Colin, that's sometimes what we deal with, maybe more so in Ontario, where we don't have, I apologize, Joanne, but freezing temperatures for 8 months of the year. Just kidding. It's 6. Like in Manitoba, where there's, I know that there was research in Manitoba looking at grassed waterways, but if your runoff happens when the ground is frozen, a grass waterway doesn't really do much. So we have to think about, exposed soil in November or December. We have to think about spring melts in February and March, these sorts of things, and soil moving. So how do we, in thinking about exactly this triangle or this flow of loss, how do we manage for this in Ontario? What are all the ways that we're trying to manage phosphorus movement?
Yeah, and so you exactly mentioned it. Our biggest ways of movement are either runoff through overland erosion, or getting through to the tile drains and draining out into our rivers and streams and that. And so it's important to recognize that both happen on every field. And really, we're trying to look at how we manage that phosphorus in that field in order to better be aware of how it leaves the field and do a better job at keeping it on the field. And so the slide I've got here is a tool that we've got within our suite of tools with OMAFA called AgriSuite. And if you haven't used it before, I invite you to take a look. Just Google AgriSuite, and it should be the first one that pops up. It's a free suite of tools, a lot of very useful stuff. But the tool that we're going to focus on today is what we call the Phosphorus Loss Assessment Tool for Ontario, or PLATO. And where this really ties in is looking at the different characteristics that the field itself has. So things like soil texture, slope, where that field's located, what crops being grown there, and then also looks at the application. And so what product are you applying? What rate are you applying it at? What time of the year are you incorporating it? All that kind of stuff. And so I've got an example here that I put together actually on one of my own fields, and looking at, basically I've identified that for my crop of corn, I want to apply 150 pounds per acre of MAP fertilizer. So I'm trying to decide, well, should I apply it this fall? We've got pretty decent weather now. I could, apply it, get it done, one less thing to do in the spring. So I plug in all my characteristics for my field, and looking at the summary on the right here gives me a bit of an indication on what risk of loss that phosphorus has. So if we're looking at fall application, broadcast on bare soil, not worked in at all, we can see that the application loss index comes up with a 198. And in this case, the numbers don't really matter. All we're looking at is whether that's high, moderate, low, very low, what kind of a risk it is. So we come up when we include our field characteristics, so things like slope, drainage, all that kind of stuff. Our total phosphorus index, if we apply in the fall, is 265. Comparatively, if we wait until May 5th in the spring, after we've had all that snow melt, that water washing off the soil, we can drop that risk by quite a bit. And we're now at 131. And if we do a little bit better and incorporate that, so whether we're working that field after or injecting that, putting that phosphorus in a band, we can drop that down now to a low risk, a 68. So essentially no risk from that application, and it's more just you've got to be aware of what that field is, where you're putting it in relation to waterways, and that kind of stuff. So this to me kind of gives a good picture of trying to minimize loss, not just for the environmental aspect, which is incredibly important when we look at Lake Erie especially and the algae blooms that we have, but also money. And I'm pretty cheap, so I'm looking at this as a way to keep that phosphorus in the field where it can do good to the plants instead of washing out the drain and heading down to the lake.
So amen to that. But also I always think about, and Ray has touched on this, dissolved pee and particulate pee, and the differences between them. But I always think about if your soil is moving, to me, that is phosphorus is moving. Like you're losing your phosphorus fertility if your soil is moving, whether that's wind or water, whatever it may be, that's what you're losing. So that's a good indication. Mark, I'm glad Peter Johnson says he's going to follow up with you, because I'm curious about this as well and feel like there's a story to be told. But Mark says that he monitors the phosphorus in the tile drain, and it's hard to get to zero, but he monitors it often. And I would imagine it would be very difficult to get to zero, but he asks, are there ways to reduce the phosphorus in the drainage water solution? So Colin, I'll maybe go to that, and Maren, so if you want to go back and find that video, or Mark, I can send it to you, because Maren has done quite a bit of work on this, I know, and she mentions in that clip, but of course there's much more to that video, about simply reducing the pool of phosphorus, but also that very quick access to that tile. So are there ways, I can't imagine it's simple, but are there other ways that we can sort of minimize the amount of phosphorus that leads through tile?
Yeah, and so the biggest thing would be being aware of those risk factors. So what's your phosphorus soil test? What kind of application are you doing? Is there a direct path through those macropores down to the tile drains? What source of phosphorus are you applying? Is it a granular that you're putting in a band next to your corn, or is it liquid manure that you're putting on 10,000 gallons to the acre? It's going to be incredible, darn near impossible to ever hit zero loss. That's just the nature of farming with drainage, is we're going to have that water move through, and any phosphorus that's available, that dissolved phosphorus that's in that soil solution, it's going to move as that water does to the drains. So I think the biggest thing is reducing your total risk up on the soil surface in how we're managing that. There are some technologies and different solutions that there's been several different researchers testing phosphorus mitigation at the end of the drain before it leaves the field. In which case there's different compounds that you can put in as kind of precipitating out that phosphorus and removing it from the water. I don't know of any systems that are in widespread use. I think it's still more on the research scale at this point, but I think there's definitely potential for some of that coming down the pipeline.
Joanne, can you yeah, I was going to say, can you go ahead, but I want you to, could you explain the dissolved reactive pee and particulate pee pathway? Because Ray is a smart man and I don't entirely know what all that means, but I think Joanne will know. So yes, but go ahead. And then if you can address that after.
I can definitely talk about dissolved P and particulate P. But before I do, I just want to say one thing that so we don't have nearly as much tile drainage here in Manitoba as you do in Ontario. But one thing that a few people have done is actually build a reservoir to collect their drain water, as well as surface water that's running off, and then use that for irrigation later. So, I mean, we have the situation here where we're often too wet in the spring and then too dry a little later. So then saving that water for later can be beneficial. But it means that phosphorus-rich water is never actually getting away on you, and you're putting it back on. Okay, dissolved P and particulate P. Essentially, exactly like you said, Lyndsey, if your soil is moving, you are losing phosphorus, as well as so many other good things, organic matter and all the other nutrients, everything, right? That is definitely a big problem in places that are hilly and where you get most of your precipitation through rainfall, and you don't have our very long cold winters like we have in Manitoba. But here, where it is flat and pretty dry and cold, we tend to lose most of our phosphorus as dissolved P. And so even though there's no soil moving, we are losing phosphorus. Where is it coming from? Some of it is coming from the soil actually interacting with snow over the winter. So that phosphorus is essentially kind of leaking upwards into the snow. And then when the snow melts and the snow is still, or the ground is still frozen, then off that phosphorus goes. It's also coming out of vegetation. And there's been some interesting but kind of disappointing, I guess, research that has shown that some really beneficial practices like cover crops, perennial forages, all kinds of things that are great for reducing soil erosion and great for so many other things can actually increase dissolved phosphorus loss, because that plant, that green, especially when it's green plant tissue that's on top of the soil, it's you get the snow, it acts like a tea bag, and the phosphorus that is in those plants, you know, the cells freeze, they burst, they release all their juices, whatever, and then in the spring, off it goes. So it's almost the opposite of what we would think of with a catch crop, where we think of a catch crop catching nutrients from the soil so they can't be lost. Here, actually, the crop catching those nutrients makes them more vulnerable to being lost. So it's not to say that we shouldn't grow cover crops, because there's lots of other benefits, or those perennials or other things, but it's just a trade-off that we have to consider here when we're losing. We lose 80% of our phosphorus as dissolved P in the spring snowmelt. So yeah, it's important to think about. So some of the key practices there are, if you apply your phosphorus fertilizer in the spring, after the snowmelt's happened, right? You apply it in the spring, you get it down into the soil, even just a couple inches, is really important, because then you don't have that phosphorus right at the surface, then interacting with the snow in the next winter.
I like that you use the word trade-off. I wish more people considered trade-offs and pros and cons, as opposed to black and white, one is good, one is bad. Everything is a trade-off, everybody. Everything. Okay, this is so fantastic. This has been a lot of fun. I have written many notes, and that means that's a good show. So we are out of time. And thank you, everyone, for the fantastic questions. I feel like Mark is going to get a phone call from Peter Johnson tomorrow. I apologize, Mark, but keep us in the loop on how things go on that one. But Colin, thank you so much, and good luck with your season of learning before the spring begins. And Joanne, good luck with your students for also your season of learning for the spring. I hope that they show up on time and bring you treats. Okay. All right. Thank you both so much. This has been so much fun. Thank you to everyone in the comments and joining us here live. We will, of course, be back next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the spray pass and trying to keep some dollars in your pockets. Tom Wolfe is going to join us for that one. So check it out next week, 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on the Agronomists. Thank you, everyone. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks.